Hey guys, it's a cold, rainy day here in Fresno, and I just came back from driving around, and I took a corner really fast, and everything's really wet right now. And my tires had just enough grip to allow me to make a pretty quick turn. And after I made the turn, I thought about how happy I was that there was plenty of tread on my tires, so it enabled me to to get the grip I needed to make that turn. And that started to make me think about race car tires and regular daily driver tires and how they differ, and they differ for very important reasons, and that led me to think about martial arts and self-defense and sport martial arts and how that works. And I know that seems strange probably to think about all those things in a row, but I think about martial arts most of the time. So usually anything I kind of start to understand, I start to equate to martial arts really quickly. So real briefly, and tires really don't matter to most of the people watching this video, I'm sure, but basically your tire's job is to make a lot of connection to the ground, right? So you want a lot of surface area to make connection to the ground. Now in a race car tire, they use a really slick tread. And the reason they do this is because the slick tread allows you to make maximum contact surface area with the track. And the track's a consistent surface that we always know about. So it's always hard and smooth and grippy. And we can always make sure we have our races when the tire, or when the conditions are optimal for the tire to grip, right? So for example, if it's rainy, or it's too cold and the track's kind of hard and frosty, or it's too hot and the track's kind of gummy, we can say, oh, we're not going to have a race today because the conditions aren't right, and so it's not safe or not ideal for racing. In a normal car's tire, we have tread on our tires, and the reason we have that tread is because when the surface that we're driving on is soft or loose, or by loose I mean like there's a lot of grit that can slide around or something like that, so like dust or rain, or if it's really slick, we need surface area, we need more surface area to catch as the tire slides along, right? So if you can picture it, the bottom's of course always connecting, but if the bottom gives way, we want to have little ridges that can kind of catch any bumps along the way that allow us to have more traction. So the everyday driver tire kind of makes a sacrifice of not having optimal traction on a perfect roadway, but when the roadway is not perfect, it gives us a lot of traction that we wouldn't have in a slick tire. And that's of course probably not important to most of you, but it makes a nice analogy for me with the martial arts. In the martial arts, if you're studying martial arts for self-defense, and that is that you want to have a pragmatic ability to take care of yourself when you're out in the world, you need to have the equivalent of a general purpose all-terrain tire. So you want a tire with a lot of ridges, so when the ground gives way on you, right? In a martial context, this is when the fighting doesn't go the way you expected it to. You have a lot more surface area in between that'll catch little bumps, right? So each martial art you study kind of gives you ridges in your tire, so you understand a broader field of study. Whereas a sport martial art is kind of like a slick track tire for racing, where it's built to optimally catch the surface we're expecting, right? So there's a surface we're expecting to be on, and this flat tire completely makes contact, so you get more surface area in that respect. How is this important to us? If you're studying something like, say, Western boxing is a sport martial art that is specially designed to understand what happens in a situation where two humans are only trying to strike each other, and only trying to strike each other with the ends of their arms, so their fists are the only things we're making contact with. That martial art is an absolute perfect martial art for understanding that kind of context where we're talking about just fighting. Western boxers are masters of that kind of context, and you could not ask for a better system to learn to deal with that kind of stuff. But the world is not always going to be a boxing match, right? Sometimes people are going to try to wrestle with you. So the sport martial art of boxing has a hard time dealing with grapplers because it doesn't train against those guys a lot. Now, that's not a necessary kind of training for boxing, but it is a necessary kind of training for overall self-defense, because someone might try to grapple with you. You don't know the surface that you're always going to be on, so you need to have lots of different abilities to handle different things. Sport martial arts are really good at talking about one kind of thing, and what they do is they isolate that thing and make us really good. They give us a way to practice over and over and over that one isolated environment. If you're studying martial arts for self-defense, you can't expect that any one of those isolated environments is going to be good for your training, because it's just like a slick track. Now, if the conditions are ideal, if you're in a boxing match and you're a sport boxer, then that's going to be great for you. But when it's rainy or dusty or the equivalent of some kind of different condition, you're not going to be able to handle it very well, and you're not going to understand how to apply those boxing skills in all the different terrains, because you've limited and isolated your training to one small bracket. It's important for people interested in self-defense to study sport martial arts, but you must be a generalist when you're studying martial arts for self-defense, because you don't know what kind of environment you're going to be in. You might be on the top of a mountain, or in the dark, or in a mall, or in your car. Who knows? You could be in all kinds of environments. And so you need to be a generalist to be able to handle all these different types of events that can happen. So for example, if you ended up in a fight on the ground, you're going to need some kind of ground grappling martial art, like say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And then a lot of people who study self-defense will say, well, I don't want to study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because I don't want to fight on the ground. And that's a correct statement. You don't want to fight on the ground, but you might find yourself on the ground. So if we go back to our analogy of the tire, as a guy who drives cars, I could say, well, I ideally always want to drive on a perfect track. And you do, but sometimes you have to go off terrain, because that's what happens, right? When we're driving every day, we don't always get to drive in the absolute perfect environment. So we want a tire that can handle different environments, and likewise, we want our training to be able to handle different kinds of environments. And the kinds of environments you're going to face are really wide, and one of the biggest problems with studying sport martial arts and sport martial arts only is you don't open up your mind to the different types of contexts you're going to be facing. So it's very likely you're going to be in some kind of weapon situation. If you only study sport martial arts, when a weapon comes into play, you don't really have many ideas about how to deal with the weapon. You're also almost never going to be in the ideal condition that you're training in a sport martial art, right? You could be training on unlevel ground, or on grass, or in knee-deep in the water, or all kinds of environments can change. And if you don't take this into consideration in your training, you're not going to be ready for it when it happens. So a lot of times when I talk about the problems with sport martial arts, I think people get the wrong idea. Sport martial arts are excellent avenues of study, but you have to realize that when you're studying them, you're only studying one isolated piece. Even in something like mixed martial arts that people feel like is such a complete martial art, so it's a great thing to study because you learn how to box, and you learn how to grapple, you learn how to grapple on the ground, and it's just such a complete method of fighting. But it's really still a very, very small chunk when you consider that mixed martial arts doesn't take into account any kind of environmental changes. It doesn't take into account any kind of weapon conflict. It doesn't take into account multiple attacker situations. So that's an awful lot of area that it's just completely ignoring. That's not to say that sport martial arts aren't really good at what they do. They're better at what they do in that specific situation than any generalist could even be generally. Because when you're looking at a lot of different environments, it's hard to master any one of those environments. And so, something like Western boxing is really good at handling what happens when someone strikes me or when I try to strike someone else. The problem with it is it doesn't have any clue about what to do with other situations. So you've got to study several different situations. You should study some sport martial arts if you're interested in self-defense, because they're excellent at dealing with their isolated avenue. But you have to keep your mind open to all the different avenues of study that you need to have, because if you don't do that, you're completely surprised when something different happens. If you think the world is all stand-up boxing, the first time someone kicks you, that's a shock. First time someone grabs your legs and takes you down, that's a shock. First time someone pulls out a knife or a stick and hits you with it, that's a shock. So all these things are surprising to you, and you don't quite know how to apply your basic skills in these different situations. So if you're studying martial arts for self-defense, you need to be more of a generalist and less of a specialist. You want to develop that all-terrain tire, if you will, as opposed to a sport slick, which is designed for one objective only. So I hope this kind of odd analogy helps some of you with your thinking about martial arts training and self-defense. I'm Chris Hine. This is Aikido of Fresno. Keep training.